Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, where we talk about all things fuel for all kinds of people. I'm your host, Erik Bjornstad, and I'll be your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. In our series, Fuel Pulse Show Back to School, we've aimed to give quick 5 to 10 minute overviews of the essential topics that go into proper fuel care and treatment. You likely at least have an idea that testing happens to be an element of good fuel maintenance. And that's what we're going to talk about on today's episode. So testing is an element of good fuel maintenance, but testing relies on being able to take a good fuel sample. Because if you think about it, a test results really are only true of the sample submitted for testing. But people assume that their sample is representative of the larger body of fuel in their system, which is why they assume that the results done on their sample are automatically what the results are going to be for the rest of their fuel. Yet, if they have bad sampling techniques and they don't get a good sample, this may not be true. So we're going to talk about how not to fall in this trap. And to do that, we need to talk about where to take samples, how to take samples, and how to handle the samples afterwards. So, first one, where to take samples. We're talking here about where in the depth of the tank, not where along its length, if you will. Tanks tend to have a limited number of access points at the top. So in most situations, you'll probably have two choices, but not much more than that. But before we talk about where to take them, let's consider how that particular question plays with what we're trying to do here. Now, you're taking a sample because you're either going to examine it visually or you're going to submit it for more standardized lab testing, like with the requirements of any yearly testing protocol that your company might have. Where you take the sample can influence those test results, potentially more in a negative way than in a positive way. Because remember, the ultimate object is to take a sample that best represents what the fuel in your tank is really like, so that any test results you get can be more easily and accurately applied to the rest of your fuel. If you think about a storage tank, the fuel can be markedly different in different parts of that tank. That is why where to take fuel samples in terms of depth is such a big consideration. The bottom of the fuel tank is where most of the particulate and the microbial contamination, that's where most of those things are concentrated, as well as that's where all the free water is. And so that's also where all the fuel water emulsions reside. Those kind of contaminants rarely ever make their way up to the middle and the top of the fuel in that tank. What would happen if you needed a water and sediment reading, or you needed to take a sample to do that? But you pull a sample from, let's say, the top of your fuel and you sent that in for testing. Very likely, it's going to come back pretty clean. And so you're going to say, I don't have any water. I don't have any sediment. My fuel's fine. But the reality is that all the water and sediment in your tank is all the way down at the bottom. But you didn't sample at the bottom. You sampled at the top. So if you needed to get a better sense of your water and sediment content, what you would need to do is pull a bottom sample. Conversely, let's say that you took a middle or top sample and they did a water and sediment test on that. But let's say that that test actually came back failing. It came back in excess of 500 ppm. Now you have a situation where there is actually value in there, because the value in that would be suddenly you really know that you have a problem, because again, those level of those kind of contaminants should be pretty low in those areas. But if those samples come back as failing, if you've got an excess water and sediment in fuel that's in the middle or the top of the tank, now you realize you've got a really big problem that test just confirmed for you. Still, even with the possibility of that kind of scenario, I wouldn't just necessarily plan to do it that way. So in a moment, we're going to run through what top, middle, and bottom actually mean in this context in terms of where in the tank that is, where in the fuel's depth that sample is being taken from. But before we get into talking about that, let's talk briefly about what port you'd want to take that sample from, where along the top that you would want to take the sample. Most above ground tanks, as we said, have at least two. They have a fill port and they have a vent port. Now, if possible, you want to try and sample from the fill port because you're going to get fuel that's more likely to be a real representative sample of the fuel in your tank. The vent port typically is not really intended to be used for sampling. So you're going to want to take it from the fill port. Now, let's talk about what we mean by top, middle, bottom depth. A sample from the top is pretty straightforward. That's a fuel sample from pretty much anywhere near the fuel depth you want to pick. Doesn't matter exactly. A sample from the middle, however, doesn't necessarily mean true middle. It actually means more like middle bottom, let's say a third of the way up. Now, exactly how far down or up this is going to be depends on the depth of the fuel in your tank. But let's say you have a 5,000 gallon tank that has a fuel depth of 6 feet. A middle sample for that wouldn't necessarily need to come from exactly 3 feet. You probably would want to do it somewhere between 18 to 24 inches from the bottom, and that would be a viable middle sample. Now, similar to this, we need to talk about what a bottom sample actually means. And one thing we need to make clear, this is very important. Bottom sample does not mean a dead bottom sample right at the very bottom, because right at the very bottom is where a lot of that sludge and that free water is. And if you happen to sample from there, what's going to happen is your sample is just going to get huge amounts of sediment and water in your sample. And that kind of sample is just not diagnostically useful. So for a bottom sample, you're not doing it dead bottom. You actually want to do it anywhere from 3 to 6 inches from the bottom. That's close enough to the actual bottom of the fuel that it's down near where that water and sediment is. So you're going to be able to do testing that will give you an accurate reflection of how much you got of that. But the sample at the same time is not going to pull in so much of that it throws off your results. And so that's going to do it for today's Fuel Pulse Show Back to School quick dive into the sticky issue of how best to do fuel sampling. Now, if you liked what you heard and you haven't done so already, feel free to subscribe to us at your podcast platform of choice. Maybe that's iTunes, Stitcher, Amazon Podcasts, wherever you happen to like to listen. And if you haven't done so already, please leave us a review if you can, because that too really helps people find us. So until next time, I'm Erik Bjornstad, thanking you for joining us, and I'll see you next time at the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.